together and we'll get started. Father, we come into your presence this afternoon, thankful for the opportunity to dig into a very sensitive yet important topic that faces us today related to reproductive technologies. Father, I ask that you would give us wisdom as we contemplate this issue. Lord, I also pray for each and every one of these students as they come to the end of the semester and papers and finals and other assignments that are coming due over the next couple of weeks. Lord, I just ask that you would give them the energy and the discipline to complete those assignments well and to finish their courses strong. In Jesus' name, amen. Last time we met, we talked about a biblical understanding of sexuality, and we walked through the various 10 points on what is a biblical sexuality. And so what we want to do today is transition into a discussion of reproductive technology. So this goes hand in hand with biblical sexuality. And because this is one of the expressions of biblical sexuality within the context of marriage, relates to the reproductive process. And so we're going to talk about a number of different reproductive technologies today, but more specifically, we're going to focus on some of the ethical questions and moral ramifications of these reproductive technologies. Now, I will tell you at the outset, there are a number of things that we're going to talk about today that it may be the first time you've thought about these reproductive technologies in this particular way. And there's also some things that you may walk away from saying, well, I don't completely agree with that. That's fine. It's fine if you think that way. You can always be wrong. It's okay. You have to recognize that this is one of the areas where we go to Scripture and we find principles related to life and procreation and things like that. But there is no passage of Scripture that you can go to that says, thou shalt or thou shalt not participate in vitro fertilization. And just not saying that God wasn't aware that this was coming, but if God had inspired, one of the authors of Scripture to write that, the people who would have been reading it, in the immediate context would have been like, what in the world is this? This makes absolutely no sense. And so we're having to apply biblical principles to an area that does not have an explicit biblical teaching on it because the technology simply did not exist. I mean, honestly, if we wouldn't be having this conversation with most of these things if it had been 50 years ago, and certainly not 100 years ago. And so it's really been only in the last century and really half century that most of these technologies have become available. Now, when we talk about reproductive technologies, this is a growing industry, and I use that term very specifically. It is an industry. This is a huge money-making medical industry. And so mainly because these reproductive technologies, for the most part, are still pretty expensive. The prices are coming down on them as they become more and more common. But it is a money-making industry. And these technologies are becoming more and more popular as the years go by for a few different reasons. First of all, they're becoming more popular because the prices are coming down. With any new technology, when the technology first comes out, it's cost prohibitive for almost everyone except for the very wealthy. I mean, think about your first personal computer. I remember my mom was calling me. My mom bought a new laptop on Friday, and so she was calling me for advice and input on buying a new laptop. And so I was on a website. She was at Best Buy, so I popped open the Best Buy website just to look and try to figure out what she was looking at. And I'm looking at some of the specs of these computers, and I'm thinking, how crazy that you can put a terabyte of memory into a hard drive today. I remember when I personally bought my first computer in 1996, and I was buying it from Gateway 2000 over the phone. You phone ordered and they shipped it to you, and it came in a cow printed box. Some of you are not even old enough to remember that. But I remember the guy telling me, listen, if you get 1 gig of memory in your hard drive, you will never be able to fill that much memory up. Ever. 1 gig. I've got somewhere in my pocket, I've got a phone that's 5.5 years old that has 16 gig in it. And some of you are like, you've got only a 16 gig phone? I mean, I've got 128, but I mean, my phone's 5.5 years old and it has 16 times what my first personal computer had. And I bought my first personal computer for $2,500. You can't even, I mean, you can buy a flash drive now that has a gig. Well, actually, you can't even buy a 1 gig flash drive. They don't make them that small. But you can buy a flash drive now. I think the one I've got is 32 gig flash drive, and it cost me like $12. So just like computer technology, all of these reproductive technologies, when they first came out, they're really expensive. And over time, the price starts creeping down to the point where it becomes more and more affordable for the average person. Now, these are, in many cases, these are still not affordable for the average person, but it's easier for somebody to reach the point of being able to pay for them. The second reason why these are growing in popularity is, in many respects, people are more open about infertility today than ever before. It's not that infertility did not exist in previous generations. It's simply that more and more people are open to talking about it, and then as a result going to their doctor to talk about it, and as a result then having access to some of these reproductive technologies that they simply would have not even thought about in previous generations. And so this is some of the reasons why they're growing in popularity. One last reason is, to be honest with you, is people wait longer and longer to get married. We talked about this earlier in the semester. It's 29.5 years old for the average male first marriage, 27.5 for the average female first marriage. As people wait longer and longer to get married and then wait to have children, if a couple gets married at 29 and 27 and they decide they want to wait 3 years to have kids, and now all of a sudden they're 32 and 30, the reality is that by the time the husband is 32 and the wife is 30, they're actually already on the fertility decline, biologically speaking. So they are past the point of peak fertility when they are first attempting to have children. And as that happens more and more often, then you're going to find couples moving towards reproductive technologies to fix the problem that in many respects is caused simply by their age, nothing else. So those are some of the reasons why reproductive technologies have grown in popularity. And I think we just have to recognize medical technology is expanding at never before seen rates. There are things becoming available all the time. And so I think what we have available to us today that is more and more common, I think we're going to see some other technologies that are coming down the line in later years that may not be available to the average person immediately, but will become available down the road. Now, the unfortunate side is that many people don't think about the moral implications of these reproductive technologies. So in large part, that's my goal for today, is to talk through some of the moral implications of the technologies. But before we do that, we need to talk through what are the types of reproductive technology. So I'm going to highlight the big ones. These are the ones that are going to be that the people in your church are going to be talking about, the ones that you need to know about. So first up is intrauterine insemination. Intrauterine insemination, sometimes you'll see it labeled as IUI. This is what historically used to be called artificial insemination, or AI. But intrauterine insemination is where you take sperm and you inject it into the uterus of the woman in order to facilitate fertilization. So the sperm is injected into the uterus of the woman, and that's simply it. So it doesn't actually cause fertilization. Fertilization does not happen in a lab setting or anything like that. It's simply you take the sperm, and rather than the sperm entering the woman's body through intercourse, sperm is injected into the woman's body by a medical professional. This was first used on humans in 1785. Now, that should be a little scary because 18th century medicine was not advanced. And so this was not a common procedure, but it was first done by John Hunter in Great Britain. But it really doesn't become popular until the second half of the 20th century. This is going to be your most common form of reproductive technology, which you can then gather is also going to be your least expensive reproductive technology. And I'm excluding from that any fertility drugs or medications or anything like that. That's kind of a different category. These are things that actually help facilitate fertilization. Now, IUI is typically used to combat male infertility. And here's the reason why. You're taking the sperm and injecting it into the woman's body, and this is done so as to bypass the natural defense mechanisms of a woman's body in the procreative process. And so a woman's body views sperm as a foreign invader, so to speak. And so there are a number of defense mechanisms in the woman's body to kill off the sperm before they could ever reach an egg. And that's why the number of sperm that enter a woman's body in intercourse is so high. It's like strength in numbers. It really is. It's like invading a foreign country, and the more people you have, the more likely you are to get the job done. But this bypasses a number of those mechanisms, those defense mechanisms, so as to help counteract weak sperm or low sperm count or something like that. Now, another area where this is growing in popularity is among lesbian couples. You think about it. With a lesbian couple, there's no way for them to have their own biological child. And generally speaking, if they are committed to one another, they are not going to want to have one of them have intercourse with a man. And so this is the way in which one or both of them, I've actually seen stories of that, where you have both members of a lesbian couple attempting to get pregnant at the same time. And so that they can go through their pregnancies together. But this is the most common mechanism for a lesbian couple to attempt to get pregnant. So that is intrauterine insemination. The next one is in vitro fertilization. In vitro fertilization, or IVF. While IUI is probably the most common procedure, this is the one that shows up in the news most often. This is the one you're going to hear about the most. In IVF, you have sperm and egg that are collected from the individuals involved in the procreative process, and then the egg is fertilized in a lab setting. So the doctors put the sperm and egg together, and that egg is then fertilized. And then that fertilized egg is injected into the uterus of the woman. So you note the difference. In intrauterine insemination, fertilization happens inside the woman's body. In vitro fertilization, fertilization happens inside the lab, and the fertilized egg is then injected into the uterus. Once that egg is injected into the uterus, implantation in the endometrium occurs then naturally. And from that point forward, the pregnancy continues like any other pregnancy. This was the first child born of in vitro fertilization will be celebrating her 40th birthday this summer. Her name is Louise Brown. She was born July 25th, 1978. So the first successful attempt at in vitro fertilization in humans is just over 40 years old. The procedure took place roughly October-ish of 1977. Now, here's the thing to think about, and we'll address this with intrauterine insemination as well. Where do the sperm and egg come from? Well, in IVF, there's 4 different possible combinations. You can have the husband's sperm and the wife's eggs. You can have the husband's sperm and donor eggs. You can have donor sperm and the wife's eggs. Or you can have donor sperm and donor eggs. So you got 4 different possibilities of where the gametes, the sperm and egg, come from. Now, if we were to look at intrauterine insemination, you could have the husband's sperm, or you could have donor sperm. And so sometimes this is called IUI-H, and this is IUI-D, to designate where the sperm come from. But these are your options. We're going to talk about the moral implications of these various alternatives here. Now, interestingly, the first time an egg was actually fertilized outside a woman's body was actually in 1934, but that egg was not implanted in the uterus. That didn't happen until 1977, and then she was born in 1978. My guess is you'll probably see some news stories this summer with Louise Brown celebrating her 40th birthday. You'll probably see some news stories about IVF coming later this summer. Now, some other technologies, these are listed as others in your notes here. I just want to highlight a few of them. I'm not going to write them up on the board. You have gamete intrafallopian transfer. These first couple are, really first 3 are variations on IVF. So in gamete intrafallopian transfer, what happens is that they take the woman's egg and mix it with the sperm and then take that mixture and inject it into the fallopian tube. So the fertilization procedure does not actually happen in the lab. It still happens well, theoretically, it happens in the woman's body. It could happen fairly quickly before they actually inject that that mixture into the fallopian tube. But the idea is that it's injected in the fallopian tube, and then fertilization occurs, and that fertilized egg finishes the journey down the fallopian tube into the uterus, where it then implants in the endometrium. Now, in order for this to happen, a woman has to have healthy fallopian tubes. Otherwise, it's not going to, the doctors aren't going to allow for it. The other one, another variation is called zygote intrafallopian transfer, or ZIFT. So gamete intrafallopian transfer is GIFT. Zygote is ZIFT. You can tell these apart by the first word, gamete or zygote. Gamete is the individual reproductive parts, sperm and egg. Zygote is a fertilized egg. So in zygote intrafallopian transfer, what happens is you basically have IVF. The egg is fertilized in the lab setting, but instead of injecting the fertilized egg into the uterus, it's actually injected into the fallopian tubes to then finish the journey down the fallopian tube into the uterus. Again, this is, a woman has to have healthy fallopian tubes in order for this to work as well. Another additional procedure, which it's really not a, it's not a different procedure so much as it is an add-on procedure that's added on to IVF, is called intracytoplasmic sperm injection, or ICSI. In intracytoplasmic sperm injection, the the technician actually selects a single sperm and injects it into the egg. I mean, you got to think about this for a second. Whether you have any moral problems with this or not, and there are some moral issues to think about here, but you got to think about the technology for a second. A single microscopic sperm is selected and injected into a microscopic egg. I mean, this is high-end technology here. And so basically through ICSI, they can then ensure that that egg is then fertilized, and then they take that egg and you could complete actually any of these, or either IVF or ZIFT. Either one of them could be the finishing delivery mechanism for that particular fertilized egg. But those are kind of add-ons or variations of IVF. And then the last one, which is another further add-on, but it's in its own category, is surrogacy. Surrogacy is just, it's an add-on to IVF. The only way surrogacy really happens today is through the use of IVF. But so basically what happens in surrogacy is that you have an egg that is fertilized with sperm, and then the couple who is responsible for that fertilized egg then has a contract with another woman who is not biologically related to the child. And that woman, the fertilized egg is then implanted or injected into that woman's uterus, and she carries the child, gives birth to the child, and is under contract upon giving birth to give that child over to the ones who have the contract with her to carry that child. And she is paid, by the way. She's generally paid pretty well. Not only does she get just her payment for participating in this procedure, but usually during that, it's usually about a 12-month period, all of her medical bills are taken care of as well. That's part of the agreement. And so this is surrogacy rates, they vary, but a woman in the United States can expect to get anywhere from about, $5,000 up to maybe $50,000 to be a surrogate. Depends on the people who you have the contract with and what you bring to the table. But you have a contractual obligation to then give that child up as soon as the child is born. And so then there's a whole list of other issues related to that, whether or not some people want the surrogate to continue to be involved in the child's life. Some people want the surrogate to nurse the child. Some people don't want to see or hear from the surrogate ever again. There's all sorts of variations on this. One of the other things that is big right now is surrogates in the country that has the fastest growing rate of surrogacy is India. Think about it for a second. Let's say a woman could get $15,000 for a 12-month period of being a surrogate in India. That is life-altering money for a woman in one of the lower castes in India. Life-altering money. And 3, 4, 5 times over a period of several years. And so she could theoretically get $50,000, maybe even $100,000 over the span of about 8 to 10 years doing that. If $15,000 is life-altering for one of those women, then $50,000 or $100,000, and that's completely changing your family's trajectory by doing that. And that's one of the reasons why this is very popular. There are some countries who have outlawed surrogacy. Interesting, like Australia has outlawed surrogacy, and a few other countries have outlawed it. Now, let's kind of put some numbers on here. So intrauterine insemination, generally speaking, might cost you a couple $1,000s per procedure. You can have the procedure as often as once a month until a woman becomes pregnant. Probably going to cost you a couple $1,000s. In the realm of medical technology, that's pretty cheap. If you don't think that's cheap, go have a quick visit to the emergency room, and you'll find out that a couple $1,000s for medical procedures is pretty cheap. Especially when you realize that aspirin they just gave you the emergency room costs you $250 per pill. In vitro fertilization, this price has been coming down. Average price today looks something in the range of $12,000 to $20,000. I know you're like, $12,000 to $20,000. That's more than I make all year. But that some of you are like, you're not laughing because it's funny. You're laughing because it's true, right? I know how it goes. But in vitro fertilization, not that long ago, would have cost you $50,000, $75,000, maybe even $100,000. And so the fact that it's down to $12,000 to $20,000 is actually significantly cheaper than it was just a decade or two ago. We actually had our next door neighbors when we lived in North Carolina at a house, and our next door neighbors, he was a Durham police officer, and she was a Wake Forest school teacher, and they had in vitro fertilization. They have a daughter who's literally just about 6 weeks younger than our oldest, and they had 2 rounds of in vitro fertilization before they had her. They took it all out on their house, and so they actually owed. By the time it was all said and done, I don't know how they got a bank. This is before all the mortgage regulations changed. It was 14 years ago. They actually owed twice what their house was worth when it was all said and done, because they had taken that much out against their house. And like I said, you wouldn't be able to do that today. But this is before all the housing crisis and everything. And there were banks that would let you do that kind of stuff. But yeah, so here they were. They had over $100,000. Our houses were not big and all that nice, but they had over $100,000 in medical debt borrowed against their house to go through 2 rounds of in vitro fertilization to the tune of about $50,000 a piece. So then surrogacy, I've already kind of told you what numbers look like, anywhere from $5,000 to $50,000. Let's also put it in perspective of how much money if you're going to insert any of these variations. Clearly, if you're going to have in vitro fertilization with the husband's sperm and the wife's egg, or intrauterine insemination with the husband's sperm, there's not going to be any added cost. That IVF procedure, that $12,000 to $20,000 is going to include sperm and egg collection. Sperm collection is quick, simple, easy, and free for the most part. Egg collection, not so much. In fact, most of the cost in IVF is in the egg collection, because the drugs, in order to, when a woman's eggs are collected, they don't just want to collect 1 or 2 eggs. They want to collect 1 or 2 dozen eggs. The woman's ovaries don't normally produce 12 to 24 mature eggs at a time. And so the woman has to take drugs in order to hyperstimulate her ovaries so that they'll release as many as 2 dozen eggs simultaneously. And then they have to be retrieved from the ovaries. And so all that procedure in and of itself is more than half the expense of in vitro fertilization. Also included in vitro fertilization is usually the storage fee for 1 year of frozen embryos. And that's usually included. You get 1 year free, and then you have to pay from that point forward that varies pretty widely depending on the fertility clinic and their storage facility and how state-of-art the storage facility is. The most state-of-art storage facilities are changing the liquid nitrogen 4 to 6 times per day to keep it at a steady temperature. And so those types of storage facilities are going to run you about $500 per month. And so, but I've seen storage rates as low as $75 to $100 per month. So it can range anything from about $1,000 a year to about $6,000 a year for storage. But you get the first year free in most cases. We start talking donors, though. Donors are a different story. There was a story in the Harvard Crimson, the student newspaper at Harvard University several years ago. There were 2 ads taken out looking for sperm and egg donors. The advertisement for egg donors was looking for a woman who was at least 5'10". So immediately that eliminated, like 3/4 of the women on Harvard's campus, probably maybe even more than that. But she had to be 5'10", blonde hair, blue-eyed, fair-skinned, athletic, and a minimum score on her SAT, which at Harvard wasn't all that. The minimum score was like 1,500 on the SAT. Well, that was 90% of the women enrolled at Harvard. But had all the, and then had a number of other specifications. She had to have an athletic build and had played certain sports in high school and blah, 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 all this kind of stuff. So they had a price, what they were offering. Anybody want to guess what that price was for 1 round of egg donation?
2,000.
Keep going up.
Double it.
50 grand. $50,000 for egg donation. There was also an ad for looking for a sperm donor. They wanted the sperm donor to be at least 6'3", blonde hair, blue-eyed, fair-skinned, athletic build, minimum score on the SAT. It was all the same kind of stuff. What do you think they were offering for that sperm donor?
$250.
Nope. Go down. A pair of movie tickets. So probably about $25. This is Cambridge, Massachusetts. Movies are more expensive up there. And this was about 6 years ago. So basically the equivalent of $25 for the sperm donor and $50,000 for the egg donor. Now they did say if the donation was successful for the sperm donor and it resulted in a child, that they would toss in a couple restaurant gift cards. I'm being serious. I'm not making this up. So get up to about $100 out of it. And so but when you talk about cost, if you go into the realm of donor eggs, now $50,000, this is obviously a high-end client looking for somebody very specific. They're advertising on Harvard's campus. They're not just going for your run-of-the-mill egg donor here. But egg donation can easily run more than $10,000. And that's not the cost of the procedure. That's just simply to pay the woman to be an egg donor. You still have to pay for all the costs related to retrieving all those eggs, which is generally worked into the overall cost of in vitro fertilization. So put it in perspective now. Let's take for a second. If you were to do in vitro fertilization with donor sperm and donor eggs and to use a surrogate, I just want to put up on the board what those relationships would look like. So you've got the child right here. And so right here you have bio mom and bio dad. Those would be the biological mother and father. So in this case, that would be the donor sperm and donor egg. And then over here, you've got legal mom and legal dad. And so these would be the ones who contracted with the donors in order to conceive the child. And then you've got the surrogate. So within this picture here, there are only two people who have a biological relationship to the child. And that's the bio mom and bio dad. However, in almost every case where this is the situation that plays out, these are the two people who know nothing about the child. Because almost all sperm and egg donation in the United States is done anonymously. At best, you know a description of the individual and a donor number. And that's it. Now, the surrogate would actually have, on some level, a connection with the child. There's no biological connection to the child, but the surrogate carried the child to gestation and gave birth to the child. But in most cases of surrogacy, the surrogate has no further relationship with the child past childbirth. You're only left with legal mom and legal dad, who have no biological connection to the child, and the mom did not carry the child. But they are considered the legal parents of the child. This is why California passed a law about 18 months ago allowing up to 5 names on a birth certificate. 5 names on a birth certificate. Biological mother, biological father, surrogate, legal mother, legal father. Yes, sir.
Why did they go through all that trouble?
Well, that's one of the questions we're going to ask here in a few minutes. But it's a fair question.
It's a lot of money and a lot of time for hospitals.
Well, you think about this. So let's say $15,000 for the IVF procedure. Let's say about 10 grand for the egg donor. So now we're up to 25,000. Another $10,000 for the surrogate. So we're at $35,000 at this point. Now, in some respects, people may say, well, that's actually cheaper than adoption, which in some cases it could be cheaper than adoption. Well, that's the kicker, because if you remember, last time we had class and we talked about right at the very beginning some of the statistics of IVF. I'll pull them back up here so you can so I can get these right. So the 2015 statistics, which are the most recent ones that the CDC has released, only 24% of IVF procedures led to a live birth. So you have less than a 1/4 success rate. So theoretically, that IVF procedure, you'd have to go through it 4 times to be successful. Now, here's how you prevent from paying $35,000 each time. The egg donor, you're going to have plenty of sperm. That's not going to be an issue. The egg donor, let's say you got 18 eggs. Let's say 12 of them were viable, healthy eggs, and then they fertilized them. Let's say 8 eggs were successfully fertilized. Well, no doctor today is going to inject 8 fertilized eggs into a woman's uterus. For the most part, they limit it at 3. Now, if you remember all the sensational news stories from, that's what, a decade ago now, probably. The Nadia Suleiman was her name. She's called the Octomom. She gave birth to 8 children. It was IVF. Or that show that was on TLC a number of years ago, John and Kate plus 8. They had twins and they had sextuplets. both the twins and the sextuplets were the product of IVF. There's not a doctor, well, I shouldn't say that. There's not a doctor worth his salt in the country today who would inject 6 or 8 embryos into a uterus. They're usually going to do 2 or 3. And the hopes, if they do 3, is that 1 survives. But that's actually lower than the 6, theoretically, you got to have 4 to get 1 to survive. And so what they do is, so to prevent going through the $35,000 expense a second time, what they wind up doing is they take, if there were 8 fertilized eggs, they inject 3 of them. That leaves you with 5. This is higher level math here. You got to have 2 hands. Anytime you move from 1 hand to 2 hands, this is higher level math. Just ask my 6-year-old. But you've got 5 fertilized eggs left that are then frozen. And so to prevent the whole process from having to go through again, what they would do is they would thaw, say, 3 more of those eggs. And you hope that all 3 of them survive the thawing process. That's actually not always the case. But you hope those 3 survive the thawing process. Then those are injected into, in this case, they would be injected into the surrogate. And hopefully 1 or more of them survive and result in a live birth. If that doesn't happen, then you take the last 2, thaw them, and go. Those additional procedures, rather than costing another $35,000, are probably going to cost somewhere between $3,000 and $8,000 extra. So it's going to be a significantly smaller expense to do that again. But that's what the process looks like. This is what IVF is. So let's think through some of the moral questions related to these. Michael's he's already gotten at least one turning in his head. So we're gonna get to that question. Hang on to that question for a minute, and we'll get to it. But let me walk through a number of these questions that relate to these reproductive technologies. The first one is the question of whether or not it's immoral to separate the unitive from the procreative functions of sexual activity. So if you remember, we talked about the purposes of marriage that we saw in Augustine's On the Good of Marriage, and applied those then in the context of a biblical understanding of sex. We talked about procreation, unity, and fidelity as these purposes and how they play themselves out in the marriage relationship. We take those first 2, procreation and unity, and in these reproductive technologies, you're actually separating them. So you have procreation without the unity. So you have procreation without intercourse. So there's no physical unity of coming together that then leads to procreation. And so the first question is that problematic? Is that immoral? Well, on one hand, you'd say not necessarily, because the 2 are separated on a regular basis. Not every act of sexual intercourse results in procreation. It just simply does not. So in those cases, you have unity, you have the unitive purpose fulfilled, but not the procreative purpose. The question is it immoral to go the other direction, to have procreation without unity?
First instance that comes to mind is if you have somebody that knows they're going to be medically unable to have a child at a later date. Say they become aware they have cancer.
Mm-hmm.
They know they're going to go in for all kinds of medical treatments that's going to sterilize them.
Yep.
That would be the first opportunity, is to go freeze some eggs.
Right. And that's, or sperm, either way. That happens both ways. You even have situations where you have somebody who's been injured tragically in an accident, and before they're taken off life support, they will retrieve eggs or sperm, sperm than with eggs. But they'll do that for the purpose of hoping the surviving spouse could then have a child, a biological child with their spouse, even though their spouse is about to die or is dying right there. So yeah, that's what, see, and this is, I can't take you to First Hezekiah 13:7, and that says how to answer this question. And this is one of those issues when it comes to separating the procreative and the unitive, where we kind of wind up in this muddy gray area. Saying, well, it happens. We have this separation in other cases. That's just part of the natural process, the natural biological process. And so, can we stake a claim on this particular question? You know, where I land on it is I can't say yes, this is a moral problem that then eliminates this as a possibility. But what I can say is we need to think about the biblical purposes of sexuality to make sure as best as possible we're in line with God's design, but with a recognition that it doesn't always happen that way. Ralph? Oh, we're getting to that. That'll be after the break. So hang on to that one. But you're thinking along the same lines, and so that's good. But birth control is the post-break discussion. So you can't steal all my thunder. You know, you gotta say I gotta make sure you come back after the break. Hey, John.
So what happens if the child is not happy for the decision between the legal father and the biological mom?
Hold on, say that again. What happens if
a child is not happy for the decision that the legal mom made and the legal father made?
So if there's no child that results,
the child is now questioning.
The child's now questioning about it. Well, that's one of the real issues that you have to think about, and we'll get to that question here in a second. But it's one of the issues that you have to think about: paternity and maternity, about who's the actual mother and father. These are some of the same questions. That's some of the same questions adoptive children wind up asking.
For adoption is a different case.
It is a different case.
But now a child is a big man.
Uh-huh.
He's a doctor.
Mm-hmm.
And now he wants to discover his identity.
Yep.
And he come to know that his mom is a legal mom.
It's not his biological mother.
Biological father.
Yeah.
His biological father may be still there.
Yeah.
And now he's having all this information. When you gather them together and asking them, what they answer?
Well, here's the reality. Every parent is going to handle that probably a little bit differently, but I can tell you this. There's actually a website built for this very question, and it's called DonorSiblingRegistry.com. And it is for the children of sperm and egg donors who have found out that who they thought were their parents are not their biological parents, and that they are the offspring of donors, one or both, either donor sperm or donor egg or donor sperm and egg. And you can actually go to DonorSiblingRegistry.com. You have to pay for it, and you can register yourself as long as you have a donor number, which is usually the most information you can get. You can get the donor number, and you can register that yourself with that number as that person is your donor parent, and it will tell you if you have siblings who have also registered. It will also tell you if your donor parent has registered. It will tell you that they can locate your parent, and you can choose to then make connection with your parent. And so there are multiple instances on DonorSiblingRegistry.com of sets of siblings in excess of 150 siblings. Multiple cases where you have more than 150 half siblings in most cases, because in that situation it's donor sperm. So they all have the same father, but they've got different mothers, and they're spread all over the world. And the New York Times ran a story about when this website first came out about 5 or 6 years ago, they ran a story on it because it very quickly it located a couple sets of siblings where there were more than a dozen kids. And there was one group of them that decided they were all going to go on vacation together. They were spread all over the country, and they all met. It's the first time they'd ever met. And they were all teenagers at the time. And so their parents came too. So you had all these parents, you had multiple sets of parents, some of whom none of the dads were biologically related to the kids, but some of the mothers were biologically related to their own kids, but not the others. You had all these children. Well, as that continued to grow, there was a follow-up story about a year later that was over 150 siblings, and they've subsequently found multiple sets that exceed 150 siblings. But you're right. I mean, these are questions the kids are asking. And I'll be honest with you. I have a cousin. I guess you could make the case she is not my biological cousin, because she is I'm by blood related to my uncle, and I was almost 30 when I found out that she's actually the offspring of a sperm donor, and my aunt, not my uncle. And she didn't find out. She found out when she was 16. She was in an argument with my uncle and aunt divorced, and she was in an argument with my uncle, and she was splitting. They had joint custody, and so she was splitting time between their two houses, and my uncle wasn't letting her do what she wanted to do, and so she went home to her mom's house and started yelling about it, and she basically said, "Well, you don't have to listen to him. He's not your dad anyway." Can you imagine that as a 16-year-old girl? She goes, "What do you mean he's not my dad? Your dad's some sperm donor somewhere. I don't even know who he is." And they had used IUI. She's now, she'll turn 28 later this year. And so they used IUI about 28 years ago now.
Have a moral challenge with that situation. That's not a way to tell your kid.
No, not at all. Not at all. It was terrible. But you can also guess what probably happened with the relationship with her dad. It's completely non-existent now. And so but yeah, I mean, there's a whole bunch of issues there. So anyway, these are the types of things we got to think about. So let's keep moving. The next one that I have listed in your notes: does the sperm collection method itself make these procedures immoral? At least the ones that involve, all these involve sperm donation. You can't do these without sperm donation, or not sperm donation, but sperm collection. Let's just be frankly honest with you. This is what the sperm collection process looks like. A man shows up at a fertility clinic, and they've got a small room with a TV and some DVDs and some magazines. And the DVDs and magazines are pornographic. And he goes in there for a little bit, and he comes out with a vial or a cup that contains his sperm, and he hands it over to the nurse. Yep. On the surface, this creates a moral problem. Now, theoretically, there are ways around this particular moral problem. You could go down the road of, the wife could be with the husband, and that is, the process they use, and it's not the use of pornography. But I will tell you this, in 99% of the cases of sperm collection, this is the method used. And so this then creates a moral problem for the process of technologies that involve sperm collection. Third one, Do artificial means of reproduction tamper with the natural order? Well, on some levels, the answer to this question is yes. Artificial means of reproduction tamper with the moral order. The question is, how often do we tamper with the moral order? I mean, or the natural order, not the moral order, the natural order. I mean, if you've got a headache and you go and pop a couple ibuprofen, you're actually tampering with the natural order. So we do this on a regular basis, and we don't think anything of it. The question is, when it comes to the procreative process, are we stepping too far? This is sometimes referred to as playing God with reproduction. And again, this is the hard one. There's not a hard and fast line that we can draw and say, well, you can tamper with the natural order. You know, on some levels, we go back to Genesis 1 and find out that part of our responsibility is to rule over and subdue creation. Well, medical technology is part of ruling over and subduing creation. I mean, trust me, be glad you live in the 21st century and not in the 12th when it comes to medical technology. I mean, if you lived in the 12th century, your options for medical treatment involved, you know, distilling or crushing up some leaves and some herbs, rubbing some kind of paste on it, and then chopping it off, whatever it was that ailed you. You know, in fact, you don't have to go back to the 12th century where just chopping a part of your body off was the solution to your medical problem. You really only have to go back a couple hundred years to get to the point where it's like, well, you know, you got a problem with your foot. Well, better chop it off than let the infection run up your leg. Well, in some respects, that's true. You'd rather lose your foot than to lose your whole leg or your whole life. But I mean, that was the extent of your medical treatment. And so there are significant advantages to being alive today and not being alive 500 years ago. And so again, what this question does not in and of itself create its own moral problem, but it does point us to further moral problems when we start tampering with the natural order. Here's why. Think back to the ad in the Harvard Crimson. What characteristics were they looking for? White, Caucasian, yeah, essentially Aryan. They wanted blonde hair, blue eyes, fair skin, tall. They wanted perfection of a certain vision of beauty. Tall, slender, athletic, blonde hair, blue-eyed, fair skin, and smart. This is called eugenics. Or as it's being described today, designer babies. You want a designer handbag, you want a designer suit, you want a designer baby. It's a product, is it not? It's a product that you are engineering, that you're creating. That's where this question related to the natural order leads us. I mean, when was the last time, what would you think if you saw an ad in the Harvard Crimson or any other newspaper that said, you know what, we're looking for a sperm donor who's 5'7", obese, bald, and dumb. And we'll pay you $25. You know, I mean, you know, or yeah, exactly. I mean, you know, or you know, when was? I mean, seriously. But you know what? In a different culture, different heights, different weight ratios, different hair color, different skin tones, you know, all that kind of stuff. You see, there's different visions of beauty in different cultures. But every culture has kind of this ideal vision. And that's what the designer baby tampering with the natural order type of question leads us to, is the question of eugenics. And what you will find, there's a reason why you go on donorsibling.registry.com and there are multiple sets of more than 100 siblings. That sperm donor had a killer profile. He did. He was probably tall. He had a good health history. He was probably smart. He was probably well educated. And I'll just go ahead and say it. Not only was he tall, well educated, smart, and had a good health history, he was white, he was blonde, and he had blue eyes. I've seen pictures of the kids. It's like, wow, that's a lot of blonde hair, blue-eyed kids. I wonder where that came from. I mean, you kind of have to search. I've got one blonde hair, blue-eyed child. And you're like, how did you get that one? Well, it's because my mother-in-law is blonde hair, blue-eyed, fair skin. My wife just got all of her traits from her dad. She had some recessive genes back there that popped out on child number 3 for us, but that's why we call him our recessive gene baby. But it's not to his face. We don't call him that. But you look at, I saw one of these pictures. There's like 18 siblings, and 14 of them are blonde with blue eyes. That all came from the same donor profile. And so that's what it looks like. And that's eugenics. And as an average height, somewhat overweight, thinning hair, brown hair, green-eyed guy, somewhat offended by the fact that they're all tall. The profile is tall, slim, blonde hair, blue-eyed. But you see where that's going, though, the moral issues that this creates? The fourth one, and this is the one Michael brought up. Is it immoral to spend so much money on these reproductive technologies when there's so many kids in need of adoption? Which is a fair question. Now, I responded a little bit to Michael's question earlier, saying that if this process is going to take you $35,000, you can easily get into an adoption process that could cost you $35,000 or more. But you can also get into an adoption process that is not completely paid for by the state, but is substantially funded by the state if you're working through the foster care system and with child protective services and all that kind of stuff. We've got some friends who are fostering right now who are probably going to wind up adopting these kids, and the actual adoption costs, because they've just gone through the system and they didn't put any specifications on the system of we'll only take this or that, they're probably going to wind up paying a few $1,000s to an attorney, and that'll be the end of the process. And so rather than $35,000, their cost may be $2,500, maybe $3,000. And so this is a fair question. Now, let me play devil's advocate on that question, though, for a second. There is also a very real human element to giving birth to your own children. I mean, we're excluding the donor aspects here. We're just focusing on the couple here. There is something innate within us about being able to look at our children and see ourselves in them. It's true. I mean, for better or worse, as much as I may not like it, the older I get, the more I become like my father. I walk like him. I talk like him. I look like him. I mean, there's no doubt if you were to see me and my dad together, you're like, yep, they are related. There's no doubt. I mean, you could do the same with my mom. I favor both of them. And it's like, yeah, that's the way it is. And there's some, and I can do that with my kids too. I look at my youngest daughter, and you'd be surprised every time somebody who knows my wife, who meets our youngest daughter for the first time, they're like, wow, she looks just like you. And it's true. We've got pictures of my wife when she was 5, 6, 7 years old. And the only reason you know they're not the same child is because one is wearing clothes from the 80s and the other one's wearing clothes from today. You know, it's like, wow, that was bad style, but man, they look the exact same in the face. You know, there's something within us that desires in a healthy way to have our own children. That our genes, for better or for worse, are passed along from one generation to the next. And there's not anything wrong with that desire to have your own children. The problem comes when that desire becomes obsessive and it overtakes a responsible desire and it becomes a sinful desire. That can happen. Where that line, that's one of those hard ones. Where do you cross that line? Difficult to say. There is a line there. The question is, for each individual person or each couple, that line may exist at a slightly different place. But you have to be aware of it, which is, again, why you have to always constantly be asking yourself about your own internal motivations. Yes, sir. About adoption or just in general? Yes, these are things that I would love if people would talk to their pastor about, with two caveats on that. One is most pastors that I encounter haven't had the first thought about these things. I'm attempting to change that one generation at a time here at Southwestern. But most pastors haven't even thought about this. Second is I do get these conversations on a fairly regular basis. People come to me. My experience has been, in almost every single case, by the time they make it to me, they've already made up their mind. They're looking for someone just to confirm what their decision already is. And if, in my case, I'm oftentimes warning them against these procedures, they almost never listen to me.
Because when you said, whenever you make a sin to be going after it so much, to me, spend $35,000 just to have a kid, and you spend $35,000 towards missions, ministry, or some other thing that could be growing the kingdom.
Well, but you could see, but we could always make that case.
Yeah.
I could say you spent $3,500 on a car. Well, you could have used that $3,500 towards the kingdom. And you're getting a terrible car for $3,500. But I mean, that specific argument is, it's really not, it's almost a non sequitur, because it doesn't, you're moving across categories and you're not comparing apples to apples at that point. Because you can always make that case. You can make that case to the guy who spent $150,000 on a house. And say, well, you could have bought a house for $100 and used the other $50. Well, but see, there's always somebody, because you're like, well, because I only spent $100 and I could have bought more and I used that money for something else. Well, then the guy who spent $75,000 on a house says, no, you could have bought a house for $75,000 and used the other $25 for something else. There's always that next step all the way down.
I guess just as the situation here, life, whatever you call it, but that just seems.
Yeah, I mean, in your situation, you're working for facilities. You probably don't have an extra $35K just laying around looking for something to do. You wouldn't, if you did, you'd probably be doing something else. You might still be in seminary, but you'd be doing something else than working for facilities. But you can always draw that comparison, and it's not a fair comparison to draw. Particularly because you can make the same case for adoption. Well, somebody could easily spend $35,000 in a private adoption. And so here's where I think the difference between adoption and these reproductive technologies, this is where I think there's actually a difference in the two. Even if you were to spend $35,000 on an adoption, that's adopting a child who has already been brought into this world and is in a very difficult situation, versus spending $35,000 to bring a child into the world. And in this case, the $35,000 route is this child who you're bringing into the world and creating a very difficult situation. It may not be a difficult situation when that child's 2, but when that child's 22 and asking the questions John was asking earlier about who's my father, who's my biological mother, who are all these people in my life, that's where I think there's a difference. Is you're bringing into existence a child who into a difficult circumstance versus trying to rescue a child out of a difficult set of circumstances in adoption. All right, next one. Do reproductive technologies that use donor sperm and or eggs amount to adultery? This is probably the most difficult of the questions we deal with. So think about it for a second. So you've got, if you're doing in vitro fertilization, you could go down the road of husband and wife. But when you enter into the realm of donors, you have brought people outside of the marriage into the procreative process. Whether that, in this case, it's another woman, in this case, it's another man, in this case, it's both a man and a woman. So in my article, I make the case that because the reproductive process itself is a sexual process, despite the fact that intercourse does not take place in vitro fertilization or in intrauterine insemination with donor, even though intercourse itself does not take place, because the reproductive process is a sexual process, that you have actually crossed the line and brought a third and possibly even a fourth party into the sexual relationship. And as a result, you have actually caused someone or multiple people to commit adultery. Now, the article that I wrote in the Southwestern Journal that hopefully y'all have all read, but in case you didn't, I'll give you a quick summary of it. I'm actually walking through the process of trying to connect all the dots to gamete donors and adultery. I first presented that paper at the national meeting of the Evangelical Theological Society a couple years ago. I guess in 2016, actually. I guess is when it was. Or maybe even 2015. But that's when I first presented that paper. And I asked, when I got done presenting that paper, I asked how many people in the room had even thought about the connection between gamete donation and adultery. One guy raised his hand. Adultery, we learn from Scripture in the Sermon on the Mount, adultery does not have to involve sexual pleasure. In fact, adultery does not have to involve intercourse. But in this case, I actually think, even though Jesus connects lust and adultery, I think in this case, we actually have a pretty good case to connect the sexual process of human biology to sperm and egg donation to demonstrate that this is actually bringing a third party into the sexual relationship that is reserved for a husband and wife. Not to mention the fact that it can create all sorts of difficulties relationally between both the child and the non-biological parent, as well as the parents themselves, particularly if one is the biological parent and one is not the biological parent. Marriage is designed to exhibit sexual fidelity. Bringing a third party into the procreative process breaks that sexual fidelity. You may not agree with me, and that's okay. But I want you to at least think through that and consider whether or not you see the connection there. Nathan?
My initial thought is, so if it's in vitro or if it's IUI, and it's both the husband and wife's gametes, and you use that process, that's just facilitation of the people that are in the marriage. But if
that doesn't cross this particular problem.
Yeah, but if it's donor, you're completely substituting
Mm-hmm.
one of the
One or both.
facilitation, and then one is substitution.
Mm-hmm. Which is why, in many cases, where if you're talking about IUI, when I get asked questions and people seek my counsel, I actually, if somebody's going to go down the route of IUI, I tell them this is the only option. But it's the only option if you're going to go the hard route for sperm collection, and not just take the easy route and go to the fertility clinic and watch a few minutes of a pornographic movie or flip through a pornographic magazine. And if you're going to go IVF, I actually advise against IVF in almost every circumstance. And the only reason I say almost every and not simply every is because I'm certain at some point in time somebody will pose a possibility where I might say, okay, that would be allowable. None of those have been posed to me yet. I'll leave the door open. But if you were to do it, I would say this is the only option. Because I consider this to be adultery, this to be adultery, and this to be fornication. You might remember there was a Vince Vaughn movie two years ago, I guess now. I wish I could remember what it was called now. The whole premise of it was he discovered he had, like 500 children. That he had fathered 500 children through sperm donation. Delivery Man was the name of it. Box office hit, I'm sure. But he had fathered over 500 children. He felt guilty about it, so he decided he wanted to find all of them and have, try to at least meet his children. And, some of them didn't want anything to do with him. Some of them he couldn't find. Others of them, they were happy they had found a dad. But he'd had 500 kids. And, when the movie first hit, people were like, oh, that's not a believable premise. If you actually follow the industry, there's no specific record of somebody having as many as 500 children, but there's plenty of opportunities for people who've had over 200. In fact, there's a fertility doctor in Colorado. I think he was it's either in Boulder or Colorado Springs, and he's in federal prison now. But in like 200 and something cases, he substituted his own sperm for the sperm that had been selected by the couple. And so he fathered well over 200 children by substituting the sperm. It's not that far-fetched. So, last couple ones. Is it immoral to participate in the selective reduction process that's often a part of reproductive technology? Here's the deal. Like I said, in vitro fertilization, most doctors today are not going to inject more than 3 fertilized eggs into the uterus. But what happens if all 3 of them implant? It means this woman is now pregnant with triplets. Being pregnant with twins is a high-risk pregnancy. Being pregnant with triplets is an extremely high-risk pregnancy. And so if something happens along the way, and as they're doing these ultrasounds and they're checking, they realize that 1 or maybe even 2 of the children are not developing at the normal rate, the doctor will, this you don't have to be involved in reproductive technologies for this to happen. Any multiple pregnancy works like this. But the doctor may say, listen, we can reduce the pregnancy and remove the weakest children in the womb. This is essentially an abortion without completely terminating the pregnancy. You're just terminating one or two of the children in the womb, which again creates a significant moral problem. There was a story in the news about a year ago where you had a couple that was having a selective reduction because one of the children, she was pregnant with twins, and one of them showed signs of Down syndrome. Taking measurements of the skull and everything, it looked like this child was going to have Down syndrome. So they met with their doctor and they decided we're going to eliminate that child and keep the other one. And so they went through the reduction process, and a couple weeks later went back for another ultrasound to discover the doctor had eliminated the wrong child. So the wife was still pregnant, but she was pregnant with a child who ultimately was born with Down syndrome. They sued the doctor for wrongful birth. I'm not making this up. And won. This is a moral problem that comes with check your rates of twinning and triplets in recent years. They're skyrocketing. Because twins and triplets still happen naturally. But the rate at which they're happening are going up substantially because of reproductive technologies. I still think it's a miracle. In my graduating class in high school, 3 sets of twins. Before any of these were really common. All of them, to my knowledge, were naturally occurring twins. But here's the thing. 3 sets of twins in my graduating class. They were the only twins in our entire high school. They just happened to all be clustered in one class. So from the time I was a freshman through the time I was a senior, so that represented 7 different graduating classes. They were the only 3 sets of twins. And we had no triplets or anything higher than that. But today, most of your twins, and almost all of your triplets, because triplets are extremely rare, almost all of them are the result of reproductive technologies. Not 100%, but most of them. The last one, is it immoral to have numerous eggs fertilized with no intention of using them at all? Or just not using them all? So here's the issue. When you have in vitro fertilization and you have these fertilized eggs, let's say they implant 3, 2 of them survive, wife gives birth to twins, they decide, we've got, after that? We had 5 more eggs left in our previous example. So 5 more eggs left, we're going to implant 2 more, one of them survives, we have a 3rd child, all right, we're done, we don't want any more children, there's still 3 eggs left.
There's places where they're putting those out for adoption.
They're called snowflake adoptions, is what they're called. But this is the problem. Nobody knows the real number, but the closest number I've been able to find right now is approximately 600,000 frozen embryos in the U.S. And that number increases by about 50 to 75,000 every year. And there's just a few hundred adoptions that take place. And here's the reason why there's only a few hundred adoptions. Frozen embryos, and that's essentially then considered donor eggs. Low success rates. Those success rates are below 10% for a live birth. And so you could adopt a dozen eggs. Half of them might survive the thawing process. You got 6 eggs left. Basically 2 rounds of attempting to implant 3 eggs, fertilized eggs. And just raw statistics say there's no live birth with that. Again, that doesn't say it can't happen. But that's why when you actually get down to the nitty-gritty of what is it going to look like, most of the doctors will say, you've got about a 1 in 10 chance of having a child. And that's really, really difficult. The sad thing is I gave you essentially what it costs to store these eggs, or these fertilized eggs. And what generally happens is the same thing that happens when you get a storage facility. Some of you may have downsized to move onto campus and you've got a nice little storage facility somewhere. You know what happens when you stop paying your storage facility fees?
For auction.
It goes up for auction. The owner of the facility takes possession and they don't want it. So they put it up for auction. When you stop paying the storage facility fees on frozen embryos, the owner of the facility takes possession, but they don't put them up for auction. They discard them as medical waste. The average couple pays for about 18 months of storage, including getting the first year free. Some other concerns we've really already talked about, legal concerns regarding paternity. Who's the father? What does that look like? There's actually been some cases where these are not anonymous sperm donors, but these are known sperm donors who have, after the couple broke up, after the married couple broke up, because it was a known sperm donor, that sperm donor is now held legally responsible for child support. And so there's been a number of cases like that in the news. The danger of eugenics, we've already talked about that. The danger of enabling parenthood without marriage. So this is the whole idea of, there's actually a number of cases where single women who are not married, have no prospects of getting married, but want to have children, will go through intrauterine insemination in order to have a child, to intentionally bring a child into the world in a single parent household. And then the danger of enabling parenthood for homosexual couples. Homosexual couples have to use one of these. If it's a gay couple, they've got to have a surrogate. Now, that surrogate may also be the biological mom, but the surrogate is under contract to give that child up. If it's a lesbian couple, they could use intrauterine insemination or IVF. They need a donor, a sperm donor. And so these are all issues. So, and then lastly, danger of incestuous sex with an unknown biological relative. Most of us know all of our biological relatives, or at least how to figure out who they are. But if you've got 150 half-siblings, and you up through, 16, 17, 18 years old, you only knew about 2 of them, it could happen. So how should we evaluate it? Well, first of all, have to have respect for the sanctity of human life. Scripture prohibits us from taking innocent human life. The dignity of human life extends to the unborn. And so we need to start there. Second, we need to have respect for all human beings as image bearers. We're created in God's image. We do not treat other people as a means to an end. And I'll be honest with you. Donors and surrogates, in almost every case, are simply being treated as a means to an end. They're being used just to get something out of them. And then they're cast aside when they're no longer needed. You need to have respect for the fidelity of the marriage bond. God's design is for faithfulness in marriage. And then lastly, and the hardest one, is you've got to evaluate the motivations of your heart. That's the hard one. That's the are we pursuing this beyond the point of godliness? Have we become obsessed with something, or are we desiring something that is a good thing? All right, a couple minutes over. All right, it is 4:35, so why don't we take a 15-minute break here, and we'll